The year is 1945. World War II has just ended. Across the globe, empires are crumbling, colonies are demanding freedom, and a new kind of war is beginning, not fought with armies on open battlefields, but in jungles, villages, and the minds of ordinary people. In Southeast Asia, a small country called Vietnam is about to become the stage for one of the most brutal, controversial, and misunderstood conflicts in modern history. A war that would last nearly 3 decades. A war that would kill more than 3 million people. A war that would humiliate the most powerful military force in the world and change the course of American history forever. This is the Vietnam War, and this is what really happened at the roots of the conflict. To understand the Vietnam War, you have to go back much further than 1965, when American combat troops arrived. You have to go back to the 1800s, when France colonized Vietnam and made it part of what they called French Indochina. For nearly a century, the Vietnamese people lived under French rule. Their land was taken. Their resources were extracted. Their culture was suppressed. And any resistance was crushed violently. But the Vietnamese never stopped fighting back. In the 1920s and 30s, a young revolutionary named Nguyen Sinh Cung, who would later take the name Ho Chi Minh, meaning, he who enlightens, began organizing a resistance movement. Ho Chi Minh was educated, traveled, and deeply political. He had lived in France, worked in England, and spent years in the Soviet Union and China. He was a communist. But more than anything, he was a nationalist. He wanted one thing above everything else, an independent Vietnam. In 1941, as World War II raged across the Pacific, Japan occupied Vietnam and pushed out the French. Ho Chi Minh saw an opportunity. He formed the Viet Minh, a nationalist guerrilla organization, to fight the Japanese. And here is something that most people don't know. During World War II, the United States actually supported Ho Chi Minh. American intelligence officers worked alongside the Viet Minh. Ho Chi Minh admired American democracy and even quoted the American Declaration of Independence in his speeches. But then the war ended, and everything changed. In September 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood in Hanoi and declared Vietnamese independence. He believed the United States would support him. He had written multiple letters to President Truman asking for American backing. Not a single letter was answered. Why? Because France was America's ally. Because the Cold War was beginning. And because the United States was terrified of communism spreading across Asia. France returned to Vietnam and tried to reclaim its colony. Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh went back to fighting, this time against the French. The French disaster and America's first mistake. The war between France and the Viet Minh lasted from 1946 to 1954 and it is known as the First Indochina War. The French had superior weapons, aircraft, and training. The Viet Minh had the population on their side and a brilliant military commander named Vo Nguyen Giap. Giap understood something the French never did: this was not a conventional war. It was a war of patience. Of attrition. Of winning hearts and minds while bleeding the enemy slowly until they gave up. The French kept pushing deeper into the jungle, chasing an enemy that melted away and reappeared somewhere else. Village by village, ambush by ambush, the Viet Minh wore them down. The decisive moment came in 1954 at a place called Dien Bien Phu. The French chose this remote valley in northwestern Vietnam as the location for a massive military base, believing they could lure the Viet Minh into a pitched battle where French firepower would destroy them. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. General Giap surrounded the base with tens of thousands of troops and moved artillery to the surrounding hills, something the French generals had said was impossible. For 57 days, the French garrison was bombarded, starved, and slowly overrun. On May 7, 1954, the base fell. Nearly 12,000 French soldiers were captured. It was the most humiliating military defeat of a Western power by a colonial people in the 20th century. France was finished in Vietnam. But America had been quietly funding the French war effort, paying for up to 80% of its costs by the end. Washington was convinced that if Vietnam fell to communism, the rest of Southeast Asia would follow. This was called the domino theory. And now, with France gone, the United States decided it would have to step in itself. At the Geneva Conference in 1954, Vietnam was temporarily divided at the 17th parallel. The North would be governed by Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Viet Minh. The South would be a separate state, backed by the West. Elections were supposed to be held in 1956 to reunify the country. Those elections never happened. Because the United States knew, and privately admitted, that Ho Chi Minh would win in a landslide. Instead, America backed a man named Ngo Dinh Diem as the leader of South Vietnam. Diem was Catholic in a mostly Buddhist country, authoritarian, corrupt, and deeply unpopular. But he was anti-communist, and that was enough for Washington. The stage was set for disaster. Escalation, how America walked into a trap. Through the late 1950s and early 1960s, South Vietnam descended into chaos. Diem's government became increasingly repressive. Buddhist monks were arrested. Opposition was crushed. The countryside was burning with rebellion. In the north, Ho Chi Minh and his government began supporting a new insurgency in the south, the National Liberation Front, which their enemies called the Viet Cong. President Eisenhower sent military advisors. Several hundred at first, then thousands. President Kennedy increased that number to over 16,000. But officially, America was not at war. Then came the event that changed everything. In August 1964, the Johnson administration announced that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked American destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, first on August 2, and again on August 4. The first attack was real. American ships had been operating in the area supporting South Vietnamese raids on the north, and there was a brief exchange of fire. The second attack almost certainly never happened. Radar operators and sailors on the scene were unsure. Messages were misinterpreted. Weather conditions were poor. The commander of the operation himself cabled Washington saying he doubted there had been an attack. It didn't matter. President Lyndon Johnson went to Congress. He told them American ships had been attacked in international waters. He asked for the authority to take whatever measures necessary to protect American forces and stop aggression. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin resolution with only 2 dissenting votes. Johnson now had a blank check for war. Within months, American combat troops were landing in Vietnam. By the end of 1965, there were nearly 200,000 American soldiers there. By 1968, more than 500,000. The war on the ground. Hell in the jungle. What was the Vietnam War actually like for the people fighting it? For American soldiers, many of them young men barely out of high school, Vietnam was unlike anything their training had prepared them for. There were no front lines. There were no clear objectives you could point to on a map. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere. A farmer by day could be a Viet Cong fighter by night. Booby traps were hidden on every trail. The jungle itself seemed to be an enemy. The American military strategy focused on something called attrition, grinding down the enemy by killing as many of them as possible. Progress was measured in body counts. Officers under pressure to show results sometimes counted civilians as enemy combatants. The system was rotten from the inside. Meanwhile, the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army fought with extraordinary discipline and resilience. They used a network of tunnels thousands of miles long, the Cu Chi tunnels, to move troops, store supplies, and survive American bombing campaigns. Villages provided shelter, food, and recruits. General Giap again proved his genius, keeping the war going through sheer endurance while waiting for American public opinion to turn. The Americans bombed on a scale almost unimaginable. More bombs were dropped on Vietnam than were dropped by all sides during the entire Second World War. Entire forests were destroyed with a chemical called Agent Orange, which defoliated the jungle to deny cover to enemy troops. The long-term effects on Vietnamese civilians, cancers, birth defects, poisoned water, lasted for generations. In villages across South Vietnam, American units conducted search and destroy missions, burning homes, killing livestock, and sometimes killing civilians. In March 1968, soldiers from the American Army's Charlie Company entered the village of My Lai and massacred between 350 and 500 unarmed civilians, men, women, children, and elderly people. Officers on the ground gave the orders. The massacre was covered up for more than a year before a soldier named Ron Ridenour blew the whistle. My Lai was not an isolated incident. It was the extreme end of a pattern of violence against civilians that characterized the war. The Tet Offensive, the turning point. By late 1967, American officials were publicly claiming the war was being won. General William Westmoreland stood before Congress and said they had reached the point where the end was beginning to come into view. The American public was being told progress was being made. The light at the end of the tunnel was close. Then came January 31, 1968. The Vietnamese Lunar New Year, Tet. In the early morning hours, coordinated attacks by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces struck more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam simultaneously. The ancient imperial capital of Hue was captured and held for nearly a month. Attackers even breached the grounds of the American embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the Tet Offensive was eventually repelled. The Viet Cong suffered enormous casualties and never fully recovered as a fighting force. By conventional measures, America won the battle. But the American people had been watching it on their televisions. They had been told for years that the enemy was being defeated. Now they were watching communist fighters in the courtyard of the U.S. Embassy. They were watching the chaos, the destruction, the horror. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in America, went to Vietnam to see for himself. When he returned, he said on national television that the war appeared to be mired in stalemate, and that negotiation was the only rational way out. When President Johnson heard what Cronkite had said, he reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." In March 1968, Lyndon Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The war had consumed his presidency, his legacy, and his will to fight the anti-war movement and the home front. While soldiers fought in Vietnam, another battle was raging back in America. From the mid-1960s onward, a massive anti-war movement grew across the United States. College campuses became centers of protest. Young men burned their draft cards. Veterans threw their medals onto the steps of the Capitol. Musicians wrote songs about the war's futility and horror. Hundreds of thousands marched in the streets of Washington. The movement was not without controversy. Many Americans, particularly working-class families whose sons were fighting and dying, viewed the protesters as unpatriotic, even treasonous. The country was splitting apart. In May 1970, National Guard troops at Kent State University in Ohio opened fire on student protesters. 4 students were killed. 2 of them hadn't even been at the protest, they were simply walking between classes. The Kent State killings shocked the nation. Hundreds of universities shut down in strikes. The anti-war movement reached a new level of intensity. Meanwhile, the government was fighting the movement as aggressively as it was fighting the North Vietnamese. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, ran a secret program called COINTELPRO to infiltrate, discredit, and destroy anti-war and civil rights organizations. Activists were surveilled, harassed, and sometimes arrested on fabricated charges. The Vietnam War was tearing America apart from the inside. Nixon, Vietnamization, and the secret bombings. Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968 in part because he claimed to have a secret plan to end the war. He didn't. But he had a strategy. Nixon's approach was called Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops and transferring responsibility for the fighting to the South Vietnamese army. It was, in essence, an attempt to win a war they were already losing by changing who was doing the dying. At the same time, Nixon secretly expanded the war. He authorized massive bombing campaigns against North Vietnam and against communist supply lines running through the neutral countries of Cambodia and Laos. The Cambodia bombing was kept secret from Congress and the American public for over a year. In April 1970, Nixon announced the invasion of Cambodia. The reaction at home was explosive. The anti-war movement exploded with new fury. Congress moved to restrict the president's war powers. Nixon also authorized a campaign of political espionage against his opponents, wiretapping, break-ins, and dirty tricks that would eventually unravel in the scandal known as Watergate. The paranoia of the Vietnam War era fed directly into the abuse of power that destroyed his presidency. In 1972, Nixon and his national security advisor Henry Kissinger were pursuing peace negotiations with North Vietnam in Paris. In December 1972, those negotiations broke down. Nixon ordered the most intensive bombing campaign of the entire war, the Christmas bombings, targeting Hanoi and Haiphong for 11 days with B-52 bombers. It was criticized around the world as an act of senseless brutality. The bombing brought the North Vietnamese back to the table, and in January 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed. American combat troops would withdraw. American POWs would be released. North and South Vietnam would remain divided. Nixon declared the fall of Saigon. The peace agreement was, in reality, a fig leaf allowing America to leave a war it could not win. Almost immediately after American troops withdrew, fighting resumed between North and South Vietnam. The United States continued to send military aid to the South, but Congress, exhausted and disillusioned by the war, began cutting funding. The South Vietnamese army, despite years of American training and billions of dollars in equipment, could not hold. Unit by unit, province by province, the North advanced south. By early 1975, the collapse was accelerating. South Vietnamese forces were surrendering or fleeing. Cities fell one after another. Da Nang. Hue. The country was crumbling. On April 29, 1975, the order was given for the final evacuation of Saigon. What happened in the next 24 hours became one of the most iconic and heartbreaking images of the 20th century. American helicopters flew in loops between the U.S. Embassy rooftop and aircraft carriers waiting offshore. Thousands of South Vietnamese citizens desperate to escape crowded the embassy grounds. Some had worked with Americans for years and feared what would happen to them under communist rule. Many were left behind. The last helicopter lifted off from the embassy roof in the early morning hours of April 30, 1975. Hours later, a North Vietnamese tank crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon. The war was over. Saigon was renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam was reunified under communist rule, exactly what Ho Chi Minh had been fighting for since 1941. At the cost, what the war left behind. The numbers are staggering and almost impossible to fully absorb. More than 58,000 American soldiers died in Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands more came home wounded. Physically, psychologically, in ways that lasted the rest of their lives. Post-traumatic stress disorder was barely understood at the time. Veterans came home to a country that didn't know how to welcome them, that was still arguing about whether the war had been right or wrong, that sometimes blamed the soldiers for the policies of their government. For Vietnam, the toll was catastrophic. Estimates of Vietnamese dead, military and civilian, North and South, range from 1.5 million to over 3 million people. Hundreds of thousands more died in neighboring Cambodia and Laos as the war spilled across borders. The land was poisoned. The infrastructure was destroyed. The country that emerged from 30 years of war was exhausted, traumatized, and desperately poor. The effects of Agent Orange continued for decades after the last bomb fell. Children born years after the war ended suffered from cancers and birth defects linked to the chemical. Unexploded ordnance. Bombs and landmines left in the soil, continued killing Vietnamese civilians for years, and in some rural areas, still does today. In Cambodia, the American bombing and the destabilization of the country contributed to the rise of one of the most murderous regimes in history, the Khmer Rouge, which killed an estimated 1.5 to 2 million of its own people between 1975 and 1979. The war's consequences extended far beyond Vietnam. The lies, what governments knew and didn't say. In 1971, a massive leak changed how Americans understood their own government. A Defense Department analyst named Daniel Ellsberg leaked 7,000 pages of classified government documents to the New York Times. These documents, which became known as the Pentagon Papers, revealed that the United States government had systematically lied to the American public about the war. The Johnson administration had known as early as 1965 that the war was probably unwinnable. Internal assessments were pessimistic. The strategy was not working. But publicly, officials kept claiming progress was being made, light was visible at the end of the tunnel, the enemy was weakening. The gap between what the government knew and what it told the people was enormous and deliberate. The Nixon administration tried to stop publication of the Pentagon Papers, claiming national security. The Supreme Court ruled against them. The documents were published. The Pentagon Papers confirmed what many Americans had already suspected: they had been deceived. Their sons had been sent to die in a war that their leaders privately doubted could be won, for goals that kept shifting because the real goal, simply not being the administration that lost Vietnam, could never be admitted publicly. The betrayal of trust was profound and lasting. American faith in government, already shaken by the Kennedy and King assassinations, fell further. The Vietnam era planted seeds of cynicism about political institutions that never fully grew back. The lessons. What the war meant. So what did the Vietnam War mean? What can we actually learn from it? The first lesson is about the limits of military power. The United States had the most powerful military in the world. It had nuclear weapons, supersonic jets, napalm, and the most sophisticated killing technology ever built. And it could not defeat an enemy that was motivated, patient, and fighting on its own soil for its own independence. Military superiority is not the same as the ability to win a war. A population that does not want you there, that sees you as an occupier, that is willing to suffer enormous losses for what they believe in, that population cannot be defeated by firepower alone. The Vietnamese proved it. History has proven it many times since. The second lesson is about the danger of ideology replacing reality. The domino theory, the belief that if one country fell to communism, all the others around it would fall too, drove American policy for decades. But it was wrong in its assumptions. Vietnam did become communist. Cambodia and Laos also fell. But the rest of Southeast Asia did not. The dominoes did not fall. The theory was flawed, and thousands of people died because leaders held on to it long after the evidence had turned against it. The third lesson is about truth and accountability. Governments lie. Not always, not entirely, but they lie, especially in wartime, when the stakes are high and the temptation to manage public perception is overwhelming. The Pentagon Papers, the Gulf of Tonkin deception, the false optimism pumped out by military officials year after year. All of it points to a system that prioritized its own continuation over honest accounting to the people it was supposed to serve. The fourth lesson is about the human cost of abstraction. When policymakers talk about acceptable losses and strategic objectives, they are talking about human lives. The soldiers who died in the Ia Drang Valley, the children burned by napalm in Vietnamese villages, the families broken apart on both sides, these were not abstractions. They were people. And any honest accounting of the war has to start and end with that fact. The fifth and perhaps most uncomfortable lesson is this: America lost. Decisively. For a country that had never lost a war, the defeat was deeply disorienting. The strategies and assumptions that had made America dominant in the Second World War, overwhelming firepower, industrial superiority, moral clarity, did not translate to a guerrilla war in Southeast Asia. The military learned tactical lessons from Vietnam that it applied in subsequent conflicts. But the deeper strategic lesson, about choosing which wars to fight and why, proved harder to absorb. In the decades that followed, the United States found itself in other long wars, in other countries, fighting against other insurgencies, and struggling with many of the same problems. Vietnam today. Today, Vietnam is a unified, independent country of nearly 100 million people. It is one of the fastest-growing economies in Southeast Asia. It has diplomatic relations with the United States, established in 1995, just 20 years after the fall of Saigon. American tourists visit the Ho Chi tunnels and the War Remnants Museum in Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnamese and American veterans have met each other, shaken hands, and tried to make sense of what happened between their countries. Vietnam won its independence. That is what Ho Chi Minh wanted in 1945 when he declared it for the first time. It took 30 more years, and millions of lives, to achieve what might have been achieved peacefully if the United States had responded to his letters, had supported the 1956 elections, had recognized that nationalism and communism were not the same thing. History does not offer clean endings or satisfying verdicts. The Vietnam War is not a simple story of good versus evil. It is a story of ideology and fear, of courage and atrocity, of ordinary people caught in the machinery of great power conflict, of leaders who convinced themselves they were doing what was necessary until the reality became impossible to deny. It is a story that every generation needs to understand. Not to assign blame, but to see clearly the forces that drive nations into catastrophic decisions, and to learn, if we can, how to recognize them before it happens again. The war ended in 1975. Its lessons are still unfinished.